When I decided to take a week off and retreat to my late grandfather's rural home, I thought it would be an escape from the constant noise of the city. Stress had been wearing me down, and the idea of peace and quiet in the countryside felt like a balm for my frayed nerves. The house, sitting on an expanse of overgrown land, was old but sturdy. It was the kind of place that carried history in its walls, with creaking wooden floors and antique furniture that hadn't been touched in years. My grandfather had been fiercely protective of this land, always saying that the underground oil veins were worth more than any developer could offer. But I wasn't thinking about oil or history as I arrived. All I wanted was rest. The first night, I lit the kerosene lamp that hung on the wall, the soft yellow glow illuminating the main room. I had forgotten the portable power station I'd planned to bring, and there was no electricity here. Still, I felt oddly comforted by the simplicity of the light, its flickering flame casting shadows that danced on the walls. As I settled into bed, I listened to the sounds of the countryside, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a single, low note from what sounded like a trumpet. It was faint but unmistakable. I sat up, startled, my heart beating faster. The sound hung in the air for a moment before fading into silence. I waited, straining my ears, but it didn't come again. Convincing myself it was a figment of my imagination, perhaps a distant train horn or a dream I'd been slipping into, I eventually fell asleep. The second night, it happened again. This time, the note was clearer, sharper, cutting through the silence like a blade. It wasn't a melody, just a single drawn-out sound. I got out of bed, grabbed the kerosene lamp, and peered out the window. The yard was empty, the moon casting its pale light over the field. No signs of life. The sound couldn't have come from far away. The nearest neighbor was miles down the road, and there were no vehicles or signs of people around. Feeling uneasy, I decided to set up my phone to record the night. If the trumpet sound was real, I'd catch it. On the third night, the trumpet woke me again, pulling me from a restless sleep. This time, I stayed in bed, gripping the blankets as the sound lingered longer than before, vibrating in my chest. The house felt colder, the shadows from the kerosene lamp stretching unnaturally across the room. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I knew there was no one out there. Morning came, and with it, the playback from my phone's recording. I listened with bated breath as the quiet sounds of the countryside filled the speaker. At first, it was just crickets, the occasional creak of the house settling, and my own restless movements. Then there was a low, mournful trumpet note, so clear and resonant that it made my skin crawl. It wasn't in my head. It was real. By this point, I was ready to leave. Whatever relaxation I'd hoped for had turned into paranoia. But the thought of driving back to the city after 3 sleepless nights felt exhausting. I decided to stay one last night and head back at first light. The final night was the worst. I barely slept, too scared to close my eyes for long. The trumpet note came earlier than usual, and this time, it repeated 3 long, mournful blasts that seemed to echo through the entire house. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing the kerosene lamp, I stormed outside, determined to find the source. The field stretched out in every direction, empty and still. But as I stood there, the note came again, louder, more forceful, as if mocking me. It was coming from beneath my feet. The earth seemed to vibrate with the sound, a deep, rumbling resonance that I could feel in my bones. I staggered back, nearly dropping the lamp. The air around me felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. And then the ground split. It wasn't a massive crack, but enough to release a thin stream of black liquid, oil, bubbling to the surface like blood from a wound. The trumpet note blared again, deafening now, and I ran. I left the house that night, not even stopping to pack my things. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the faint glow of the kerosene lamp still burning inside the house. The sound of the trumpet followed me for miles, fading only when I reached the outskirts of the town. I don't know what's buried beneath that land or why my grandfather was so adamant about keeping it in the family. But I do know this. The trumpet still haunts me. Sometimes, late at night in the city, I hear it again, a low, mournful note that pulls me back to that empty house and the dark, trembling earth. 3 months after fleeing my grandfather's house, I couldn't shake the lingering questions. What had caused the strange trumpet sounds? Why had oil bubbled up from the ground? And why had my grandfather been so insistent that we keep the property? Night after night, I found myself waking up in a cold sweat, the mournful sound of the trumpet echoing in my dreams. Each time, it seemed louder, closer, more insistent, as if calling me back. Finally, I decided to return. This time, I prepared carefully. I packed a portable generator, enough fuel for several days, a high-powered flashlight, and a digital recorder. I told myself I was going back to confront whatever was haunting me, not just for answers, but to lay it to rest if that was even possible. The drive to the house was long and uneventful, but as I approached the property, a sense of unease settled over me. The house looked just as I'd left it, its weathered exterior bathed in the orange light of the setting sun. The yard was overgrown, the tall grass swaying in the wind like silent spectators. I parked my car, unloaded my supplies, and stood at the edge of the porch, staring at the door. It felt wrong to be back, like I was trespassing somewhere I didn't belong, but I wasn't going to turn back now. Inside, the house was colder than I remembered, the air thick with the scent of kerosene and something else, something faintly metallic. I set up the generator in the main room, plugging in a small lamp and my recorder. As the steady hum of the generator filled the space, it felt like I was pushing back against the oppressive silence that had claimed the house. For the first few hours, nothing happened. I explored the house, flashlight in hand, checking each room for any signs of disturbance. Everything was just as I'd left it, right down to the kerosene lamp still sitting on the kitchen counter. But as night fell, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew heavier, colder, and the faint metallic smell became more pronounced. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of the room, and the old house creaked and groaned as if it were alive. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, I heard it. The trumpet. The sound was louder than I remembered, vibrating through the walls and floor like a living thing. I grabbed my recorder and flashlight, heading outside to see if I could pinpoint the source. The night was dark and still, the stars obscured by thick clouds. But the sound was unmistakable, coming from the field behind the house. As I stepped into the tall grass, the ground beneath me felt soft, almost spongy, and the smell of oil grew stronger. My flashlight illuminated the field ahead, where I could see a dark, wet patch of earth, the same spot where oil had surfaced before. I crouched down, examining the area. The ground was slick and shiny, the oil bubbling up slowly, almost lazily. But as I stared, I realized something was wrong. The bubbles weren't random. They were rhythmic, pulsing in time with the sound of the trumpet. And then the ground shifted. I stumbled back as the earth began to quake, the oil bubbling faster now, spilling over and staining the grass. A low, guttural rumble joined the sound of the trumpet, and the air felt like it was vibrating around me. Suddenly, a crack split the ground wide open, and a blinding light shot up from the depths. I shielded my eyes, struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The light pulsed and flickered, and in its glow, I saw shapes, figures, moving just below the surface. They were humanoid but distorted, their bodies elongated, their faces blank and featureless. One by one, they began to emerge. They rose slowly, their movements unnaturally fluid, their bodies glistening with oil. The trumpet sound grew louder, deafening now, and I realized it wasn't just a sound, it was a call. These things, whatever they were answering it. I backed away, my heart pounding, as the figures turned toward me. Though they had no eyes, I could feel their gaze, cold and piercing, as if they were looking straight into my soul. One of them stepped forward, its movements deliberate and unervingly smooth. It raised a hand, and the trumpet sound stopped abruptly, plunging the night into a suffocating silence. "You were warned," it said, its voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I don't understand, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, oil dripping from its outstretched hand. This land is ours. It has always been ours. The trumpet calls to those who do not belong. I'll leave, I said, stepping back. I'll leave and never come back. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised its hand higher, and the other figures began to move toward me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the house, only that I slammed the door behind me and didn't stop running until I reached my car. As I drove away, the trumpet sound followed me, echoing through the night. Even now, back in the city, I can still hear it sometimes, faint and distant, a reminder that the land I once called home is no longer mine. And I know one thing for certain, I'll never go back. 5 years after my harrowing experience, I thought I had moved past the haunting memories of my grandfather's land. But when a prominent oil company offered to invest in drilling operations on the property, I found myself drawn back to the land. The promise of wealth and the reassurances from geologists that everything was stable convinced me to allow the project to proceed. For a year, the operation was uneventful. The company drilled several wells, extracted high-quality oil, and built a fully functioning site with advanced machinery and living quarters for the workers. There were no reports of anything unusual, and I began to think my earlier experience was nothing more than the product of stress and an overactive imagination. But when the investor invited me to visit the site for a tour, everything changed. Arriving at the site, I was impressed by the scale of the operation. The barren, overgrown land I remembered was now a hub of activity, with gleaming machinery and a workforce of skilled operators. The investor greeted me warmly, showing me around the various stations. The wells were deep and productive, and the engineers proudly demonstrated the efficiency of their setup. As the sun set, the mood shifted subtly. The once bustling site grew quiet as workers began shutting down operations for the night. I stayed in a modest guest cabin on the edge of the property, planning to leave the next morning. Around 9 p.m., just as I was preparing to sleep, the power cut out. At first, I thought it was a temporary glitch, an inconvenience, but nothing alarming. I stepped outside to see if anyone was working on the issue, but the site was eerily silent. The only light came from the portable lanterns scattered around. That's when I heard it. A single low trumpet note, deep and mournful, carried through the air. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, scanning the darkened site for the source, but there was nothing. Then the note came again, louder this time, reverberating through the ground. I made my way to the main control room, where I found the lead engineer, Brian, frantically working to restore power. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Brian looked up, his face pale. "Yeah, we all do. The sound's coming from the wells." "The wells?" He nodded grimly. "It started about an hour ago. We thought it was just an acoustic anomaly, but now the machines won't restart. It's like the whole system's locked up." The trumpet sounded again, and this time it was accompanied by a strange, low rumble. The ground beneath us seemed to vibrate, and I could feel the sound in my chest. We decided to check the wells. A small group of us, Brian, 2 other engineers, and myself, drove out to the main drilling site in a utility truck, our headlights cutting through the darkness. When we arrived, the scene was surreal. The wells, normally quiet at night, were emitting faint plumes of steam, and the air smelled of sulfur and oil. The trumpet sound was louder here, resonating from the depths of the largest well. Brian set up a seismic sensor to try to understand what was happening. As he worked, one of the engineers, a woman named Lisa, approached the edge of the well and peered down. "I can't see anything," she said, her voice trembling. Suddenly, a deep, guttural roar echoed from the well, accompanied by a burst of hot air. Lisa stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the ground. "What the hell is that?" Brian shouted, his voice shaking. The seismic readings were off the charts. Brian's equipment showed massive activity beneath the surface, far more than what should have been possible. "It's like there's a cavity down there," he muttered. "A huge one. Could it be a gas pocket?" I asked, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Brian shook his head. "Maybe, but this is different. And that sound, it's not natural." As we stood there, Another trumpet note blared, louder and more distorted. It was followed by a chorus of strange, echoing noises like whispers, groans, and faint cries. We didn't stay to investigate further. The sounds grew more intense, and the ground began to tremble. Brian made the call to evacuate the site, fearing that whatever was happening could lead to a collapse or an explosion. Over the next few days, the company brought in experts to assess the situation. Geologists, engineers, and even a few seismologists examined the data and the site. Their conclusions were unsettling but logical. The well had likely tapped into a massive underground cavern filled with a mix of oil, gas, and geothermal activity. The trumpet sound was theorized to be caused by gas escaping through narrow rock formations, creating a resonance effect. The strange noises accompanying it were harder to explain, but some suggested they might be echoes or distortions caused by the cavern's unusual acoustics. Despite their scientific explanations, no one could deny the eerie nature of the events. The company decided to suspend operations indefinitely, citing safety concerns. As for me, I sold the land shortly afterward. The buyer was another corporation interested in exploring its potential, but well aware of its risks. I haven't been back since, but sometimes late at night I still think about the trumpet sound. I tell myself it was just gas and rock formations, a natural phenomenon exaggerated by my fear. Yet, deep down, I can't shake the feeling that there was something more, something buried beneath the land, waiting for us to dig just a little too deep.